So, think about this for a second. How do you even begin to build the world's largest democracy from the ground up, especially right after centuries of colonial rule and just a traumatic partition? Well, that's exactly what we're diving into today. This is the incredible story of how modern India was forged. You've probably heard these words before. They're just electric, right? That's India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, speaking right on the eve of independence. And you can just feel it, that pure, unfiltered hope. It's this incredible sense of promise for a new nation finally in control of its own destiny. But here's the thing. That incredible destiny, it was born from a really painful paradox. I mean, on one hand, you had the promise of freedom, popular sovereignty, a self-reliant economy, all these amazing ideals. But on the other hand, you had the brutal reality of partition. We're talking mass violence, millions displaced. The new nation was being tested from its very first breath.
So, the big question is, how did they pull it off? That's what we're going to break down in this explainer. We'll walk through the 5 key stages of building the nation. We'll start with the initial blueprint, then the moment of independence itself. After that, we'll look at democracy's first giant leap, that first election. Then the absolutely monumental task of uniting all these kingdoms. And finally, we'll see how they literally redrew the map of India.
Okay, so every huge project needs a blueprint, right? For India, that first framework, funnily enough, came from the very people who were leaving, the British. Let's talk about the Government of India Act of 1935. Now, this act was a huge deal. It laid the groundwork for things that are fundamental to India today. Think about it, the idea of a federation, a system for sharing power that's still basically in use. Provinces getting to rule themselves, and even a federal court that, you guessed it, eventually became the Supreme Court. It was like the essential scaffolding that the new nation was built on. All right, so that blueprint sets the stage. Now, let's fast forward 12 years. It's 1947, and the British Parliament is about to pass the law that will officially end its empire in India. This is the big one. And this act didn't waste any time. Boom, 2 new countries, India and Pakistan, all power transferred. But look at that 4th point. It ended British paramountcy. Now, that might sound a bit dry, but it was a political bombshell. It meant that overnight, more than 500 princely states were suddenly legally independent. They could join India, they could join Pakistan, or they could join no one. That one little clause created one of the biggest headaches the new government would face. So, the legal paperwork is done. The British are gone. Now comes the really hard part, the internal challenge. How do you take this beautiful idea of democracy and make it a real, functioning thing for hundreds of millions of people? Well, the first step was setting up an interim government. This was formed back in '46, led by Nehru, and it basically acted as the bridge. I mean, think about their job. They had to manage the country during the super chaotic final year of British rule, and at the same time, they were drafting what would become the longest written constitution in the world. No pressure, right? But okay, now for the main event, the election. I want you to just try and picture this. A brand new nation, most of its people are poor, a huge portion can't read or write, and they decide to hold an election where every single adult gets a vote. Look at that number, 176 million eligible voters. Nothing like it had ever been tried before. It was, and I'm not exaggerating, the biggest gamble on democracy in history. And to even attempt to pull this off, the effort was just monumental. To reach all those voters, they had to set up 224,000 polling booths. Think about that. They were setting these up in tiny villages, up in the mountains, deep in the jungles, everywhere. It was a logistical nightmare. But more than that, it was a massive act of faith in the whole idea of democracy. So what happened? Well, the results were pretty clear-cut. The Indian National Congress, the party that led the freedom struggle, won in a landslide. They got almost 3/4 of the seats. And that huge majority was absolutely crucial because it gave them the stability they desperately needed to face the next giant challenge, actually putting the country together. And that challenge was the map of India itself. See, it wasn't one solid country. It was more like a patchwork quilt, made up of the provinces the British had ruled directly, and then all these other patches. Over 500 of them, these theoretically independent princely states.
This brings us right back to that paramountcy problem we talked about. So under the British, these states had their own rulers, sure, but the final say always went to the British Crown. Now, the British are gone. Poof. A huge power vacuum. And the guy who got the impossible job of fixing it was Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel. His task? Convince hundreds of kings and princes to just give up their kingdoms and join the new India. Amazingly, most of them did. But, of course, a few really important ones refused. Let's take our first case, Junagadh. Here you have the ruler, the Nawab, who decides, yep, we're joining Pakistan. The problem, the vast majority of his people were Hindu and wanted to join India. So right away, you have this classic showdown, the ruler's decision versus what the people actually want. And in Junagadh, the people won. They actually rose up in rebellion, and the Nawab took off and fled to Pakistan. So India stepped in and did something very smart. They held a plebiscite, which is just a fancy word for a direct public vote. They asked the people, what do you want? And the answer was a complete landslide for joining India. This set a really important precedent. The voice of the people mattered more than the whim of a king. Okay, now Hyderabad, this was a whole other level of dangerous. We're talking about a huge, wealthy state smack dab in the middle of India. And its ruler, the Nizam, he didn't want to join India or Pakistan. He wanted Hyderabad to be its own independent country. Now, you just can't have a potentially hostile, independent nation right in the heart of your country. From a security standpoint, it was a total non-starter. And here, things got ugly and fast. People started rising up against the Nizam's rule, and he unleashed his private army, the Razakars, who were incredibly violent. With chaos erupting, India decided it had to act. They launched what they called a police action named Operation Polo. It was swift, it was decisive, and within a few days, the Nizam surrendered. Hyderabad was now part of India.
And that brings us to the last, and by far the most complicated, case, Kashmir. The situation here was kind of the reverse of Junagadh. You had a Hindu ruler, Maharaja Hari Singh, in charge of a state where the majority of the population was Muslim. And just like the Nizam, his first choice was independence for Kashmir. But his dream of independence didn't last long. In October 1947, tribal invaders from Pakistan poured into Kashmir. The Maharaja state was collapsing around him. In desperation, he turned to India and begged for military help. India said yes, but there was a catch. One very important condition. He had to officially sign the Instrument of Accession first. He had to make Kashmir part of India. Faced with no other choice, he signed it on October 26, 1947. And that single act formally brought Kashmir into India, and, well, it also set the stage for a conflict that has lasted for decades. Okay, so the princely states are in. The country is politically whole, mostly. But there was one last massive job to do. The internal map of India was a total mess. It was this jumble of old British provinces and all these merged kingdoms. It needed a complete overhaul, a redrawing based on some kind of logic. And the after picture was a total transformation. You can see it here. They got rid of that super confusing four-part system of states that was just a leftover from the British, and they replaced it with something much simpler and more logical, a system of states and union territories. And the organizing principle behind it all was a really powerful one: language. Now, this change didn't just happen because some official in Delhi thought it was a good idea. No way. This was driven by the people. Huge popular movements sprang up demanding states that were based on their own language and culture. The real tipping point came when a freedom fighter, Poti Sriramulu, actually fasted to death for the cause of a separate state for Telugu speakers. After that, the government really had no choice. They passed the States Reorganization Act, and that's what created the map we're more familiar with today. 14 states and 6 union territories, all drawn up mainly along linguistic lines. So when you step back and look at the whole story, it's just incredible. From a blueprint left by colonizers to a sovereign republic, from a crazy quilt of kingdoms to a union of states based on language. The creation of modern India was just an unbelievable act of political will, of imagination. And it leaves us with this huge question, one that's just as real today as it was back then. For a country that is so defined by its diversity, how do you keep building a single, unified national identity while at the same time celebrating all the different cultures that make it so special? It's a balancing act that continues to this day.